Marcus adjusted the brim of his cap, shielding his eyes from the midday sun as he pushed the lawnmower across his neatly trimmed grass. The rhythmic hum of the machine was almost therapeutic, a small victory in his ongoing effort to maintain his home in a neighborhood where he often felt like an outsider. The houses around him were large, their lawns immaculate, but Marcus took pride in knowing his property was just as well kept. He had worked hard to buy this house, and he wasn't about to let anyone make him feel like he didn't belong. As he rounded the corner of his yard, he noticed a woman striding toward him with purpose. She was middle-aged, her blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail, and her face was set in a scowl. Marcus paused the lawnmower, wiping sweat from his brow as she approached. "Can I help you?" he asked politely, though her body language already put him on edge. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. Her arms were crossed, and her eyes scanned him up and down as if he were out of place. Marcus frowned, confused. "I'm mowing my lawn," he replied, gesturing to the house behind him. "Your lawn?" she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "This isn't your house. Who do you work for?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Ma'am, I own this house. I've lived here for 2 years. Karen, though Marcus didn't yet know her name, narrowed her eyes. "I don't believe you. This is a nice neighborhood. You need to leave before I call the police." Marcus felt a familiar pang of frustration. He dealt with this kind of bias before, but it never got easier. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I can show you my ID, my mortgage papers, whatever you need to see." But Karen wasn't listening. She had already pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping furiously on the screen. "I'm calling 911, she announced, as if it were a threat. "There's a suspicious man here, and he's refusing to leave." Marcus shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my property." Karen stepped back, her voice rising as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes, I need the police. There's a black man trespassing on private property, and he's being very aggressive." Marcus clenched his fists, biting back the urge to argue. He knew anything he said could be twisted against him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began recording, determined to document the encounter. The minutes dragged on as Karen continued to glare at him, her phone pressed to her ear. Marcus stayed calm, but his mind raced. He couldn't believe this was happening, again. All he wanted was to mow his lawn in peace, but here he was, being treated like a criminal in his own yard. As the sound of sirens grew closer, Marcus braced himself. He knew what was coming next, and he knew it wouldn't be fair. But he also knew he hadn't done anything wrong. This was his home, and no amount of prejudice was going to take that away from him. The police car pulled up to the curb with its lights flashing, though the siren had been silenced. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but their body language tense. Marcus kept his hands visible, his phone still recording as he stood near his lawnmower. Karen immediately approached the officers, pointing at Marcus with exaggerated urgency. "That's him!" she exclaimed. "He's been trespassing and acting threatening. I don't feel safe." The officers glanced at Marcus, then back at Karen. One of them, a tall man with a buzz cut, held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, let us handle this." Marcus stayed where he was, his heart pounding but his face calm. He knew the drill. He'd seen the videos, heard the stories. He wasn't about to give them any reason to escalate the situation. The second officer, a woman with her hair tied back in a bun, approached Marcus cautiously. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" Marcus nodded, keeping his voice steady. "I was mowing my lawn when this woman approached me, accusing me of trespassing. I told her I own this house, but she didn't believe me. She called you guys." The officer glanced at Karen, who was still hovering nearby, her arms crossed. "Is that true?" "Of course not," Karen snapped. "He's lying. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs here?" Marcus felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay calm. "I have my ID and property documents inside. I can get them if you need proof." The male officer nodded. That would be helpful. Marcus slowly walked toward his house, aware of the officer's eyes following his every move. He retrieved his wallet and a folder of documents from his kitchen, then returned to the front yard. He handed the papers to the officers, who examined them carefully. After a moment, the female officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, it appears he does own this property. There's no evidence of trespassing." Karen's face turned red. "That's impossible. He must have faked those documents." The male officer sighed, clearly growing impatient. "Ma'am, we verified his information. There's no crime here." But Karen wasn't ready to back down. "Aren't you going to question him further? He could be dangerous." The officers exchanged a look, and Marcus could see the hesitation in their eyes. Despite the evidence, they still seemed unsure how to handle the situation. Finally, the female officer turned to Marcus. "Sir, we're going to need to ask you a few more questions, just to clear this up." Marcus nodded, though he couldn't help but feel the sting of injustice. Even with proof, he was still being treated like a suspect. As the officers continued their questioning, a small crowd of neighbors began to gather. Some whispered to each other, while others pulled out their phones to record the scene. Marcus noticed a few sympathetic glances, but most of the onlookers seemed unsure what to make of the situation. He knew this wasn't over. Karen's false accusations had put him in a position he didn't deserve to be in, and the officer's lingering suspicion only added to the frustration. But Marcus also knew he had the truth on his side, and he wasn't about to let Karen get away with this. As the sun beat down on the quiet street, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't just going to defend his home. He was going to make sure Karen faced the consequences of her actions. And he had a feeling he wasn't the only one who had something to hide. After the police left and the crowd dispersed, Marcus retreated to his home, his mind racing. The encounter with Karen had left him shaken, not just because of her blatant racism, but because of the way the officers had treated him despite his innocence. He knew he couldn't let this slide. If Karen felt emboldened enough to call the police on him for mowing his own lawn, who else had she targeted? And what else was she hiding? Determined to find answers, Marcus sat down at his computer and began digging. He started with social media, searching for Karen's profiles. It didn't take long to find her. Her accounts were public, and her posts were a goldmine of prejudice. She had shared memes mocking Black Lives Matter, made derogatory comments about immigrants, and even bragged about calling the police on a Latino delivery driver for looking suspicious. Marcus's stomach turned as he scrolled through her feed. This wasn't just a one-time incident. Karen had a pattern of behavior. But Marcus didn't stop there. He dug deeper, searching for any public records or news articles about her. He discovered that Karen owned a local boutique in town, a quaint little shop that sold overpriced home decor and clothing. On the surface, it seemed harmless, but Marcus found reviews from former employees that painted a very different picture. Several people accused Karen of discriminatory practices, claiming she paid her white employees more than their Black and Latino counterparts, and frequently made racist remarks in the workplace. One former employee had even filed a complaint with the labor board, though it had been quietly dismissed. Marcus's investigation took a dramatic turn when he stumbled upon a thread in a local online forum. A former business partner of Karen's had accused her of embezzling funds from their joint venture. The post was vague, but it was enough to pique Marcus's interest. He spent hours combing through public financial records, cross-referencing names and dates. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, evidence that Karen had been funneling money from her boutique into offshore accounts. The amounts were staggering, and the paper trail was damning. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. He had expected to find some dirt on Karen, but he hadn't anticipated uncovering something this big. She wasn't just a racist, she was a criminal. And now, Marcus had the power to hold her accountable. Marcus knew he had to be careful. If he confronted Karen directly, she could twist the narrative or even retaliate. Instead, he decided to let the truth speak for itself. He compiled all the evidence he had gathered, screenshots of her racist social media posts, testimonials from former employees, and the financial records showing her embezzlement, and sent it anonymously to local news outlets and social justice organizations. Within days, the story exploded. A local journalist picked it up, publishing an exposé that detailed Karen's history of racism and her financial crimes. The article included links to the videos of the lawnmower incident, which had already been circulating online. People were outraged. Karen's face was everywhere, her name synonymous with bigotry and corruption. The backlash was swift. Customers boycotted her boutique, leaving it empty and forcing her to close its doors temporarily. Former employees began speaking out, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment. One woman recounted how Karen had fired her for wearing her natural hair, calling it unprofessional. Another described how Karen had refused to promote him despite his qualifications, telling him he wouldn't fit the image of the store. As the pressure mounted, authorities took notice. The local district attorney's office announced an investigation into Karen's financial activities, citing the evidence Marcus had uncovered. Reporters camped outside her house, demanding answers, but Karen refused to speak to them. Her once pristine reputation was in shambles, and she had no one to blame but herself. Marcus watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. He hadn't done this for revenge. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Karen had tried to use her privilege to intimidate him, but in the end, she had only exposed herself. The story became a rallying cry for racial justice in the community. Activists organized protests outside Karen's boutique, calling for accountability and systemic change. Marcus's experience was held up as an example of the everyday racism Black people face, even in their own neighborhoods. Karen, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of her actions. Her business was ruined, her reputation destroyed, and her freedom hanging in the balance. For the first time in her life, she was the one being judged, and she didn't like how it felt. Marcus knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a start. By standing up for himself and exposing Karen's lies, he had sparked a conversation that needed to happen. And he wasn't done yet. Karen's life unraveled quickly. The exposé about her racist behavior and financial crimes had turned her into a pariah. Her boutique, once a staple of the community, was now a symbol of bigotry and corruption. The closed sign on the door might as well have read, "Out of business." Customers stayed away, and suppliers cut ties, leaving Karen with no way to recover. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry comments, and she deactivated them in a futile attempt to escape the backlash. The legal consequences were even more devastating. The district attorney's investigation into her embezzlement scheme gained momentum, and Karen was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. Her offshore accounts were frozen, and she was forced to sell her home to pay for her legal defense. The woman who had once felt untouchable was now facing the very real possibility of prison time. Desperate to salvage what little remained of her reputation, Karen reached out to Marcus. She sent him a lengthy email, filled with half-hearted apologies and excuses. She claimed she had been misunderstood, and that her actions were the result of stress and personal struggles. She even offered to donate to a racial justice organization in his name, as if money could erase the harm she had caused. Marcus read the email with a mix of anger and disbelief. He didn't respond immediately, taking time to carefully craft his reply. When he finally did, his message was clear and unyielding. "Your actions weren't a misunderstanding," he wrote. "They were rooted in deep-seated racism and a sense of entitlement. You called the police on me because you assumed I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. You treated me like a criminal for no reason other than the color of my skin. An apology won't fix that. The only way to make things right is to face the consequences of your actions and commit to real change, not just for me, but for everyone you've hurt." Karen never replied. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight. His calm demeanor during the lawnmower incident and his relentless pursuit of justice had made him a local hero. He was invited to speak at community meetings, schools, and even city council sessions. He used these platforms to share his story and highlight the dangers of racial profiling and false accusations. "This isn't just about me," he told a crowd at a town hall meeting. "This is about every person of color who's been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about every time someone calls the police on a black person for simply existing. We have to do better. We have to hold people accountable." His words resonated, and soon, Marcus became a leading voice for racial justice in his community. Inspired by the support he had received, Marcus decided to take his advocacy a step further. He organized a community event called Unity in the Neighborhood, aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding among residents. He invited neighbors, local leaders, activists, and even law enforcement to participate. The event featured workshops on racial bias, panel discussions about systemic racism, and storytelling sessions where people could share their experiences. The turnout was overwhelming. Hundreds of people showed up, many of them white residents who had never before engaged in conversations about race. Marcus opened the event with a powerful speech, recounting his own experience and urging others to stand up against injustice. "Change starts with us," he said. "It starts with having these hard conversations, with listening to each other, and with holding ourselves accountable. We can't let fear and prejudice divide us. We have to come together as a community and fight for what's right." The event was a success, sparking meaningful conversations and inspiring many attendees to take action. Several residents formed a neighborhood watch group focused on combating racial profiling, while others pledged to support Black-owned businesses and advocate for policy changes at the local level. Karen, however, was notably absent. She had been invited, but Marcus wasn't surprised when she didn't show up. He had heard through the grapevine that she had moved to a different town, hoping to escape the fallout from her actions. Whether she had truly learned from her mistakes, or was simply running away from them remained unclear. For Marcus, though, Karen's absence didn't matter. This event wasn't about her. It was about building a better future. As he looked out at the diverse crowd, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued his work as an advocate, partnering with local organizations to push for systemic change. His story inspired others to speak out against racial injustice, turning a negative experience into a catalyst for positive change. The lawnmower incident had been a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire community. It was a reminder that racism thrives in silence, and that the only way to defeat it is to confront it head-on. And Marcus was determined to keep fighting, one conversation at a time.